بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيد الأشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين أما بعد فأعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. In last week's lesson we were looking at the incident which led to the beginning of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam's prophethood and bi'athah. And I was mentioning that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam would go to the cave Hira for seclusion. He would remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the cave Hira, and he would also meditate in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And what happened was, once all of a sudden Sayyiduna Jibreel alayhi salam appeared, and he said to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, "Iqra, recite." Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam replied by saying, "Ma ana biqari'in," that I am unable to recite. Then Sayyiduna Jibreel alayhi salam then hugged Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He pressed his chest against Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam's chest, and then said to him the second time, "Iqra, recite." Again, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam replied by saying, "Ma ana biqari'in," that I am unable to recite. Then again, Sayyidina Jibreel alayhi salam then pressed his chest against Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam's chest, and the third time he said, "Iqra bismi rabbika alladhi khalaq, khalaqal insana min 'alaq, Iqra wa rabbukal akram, alladhi 'allama bil qalam, 'allama al insana ma lam ya'lam." Now, the incident which I mentioned in last week's lesson, and which I kind of started off this week's lesson with, is a very famous incident. It's a very famous hadith which can be found in many books of hadith, in particular in Sahih al-Bukhari. And from this particular hadith, many points or many rulings have been established by various muhaddithin. So therefore, I'm going to take this opportunity to mention a few in front of you. The first point, or the first ruling which we can derive from this particular hadith, is that it is an essential requirement for a mubtadi, so mubtadi is a beginner, to seclude himself from his family, from his friends, whereas for a muntahi, even though it's not a requirement that he secludes himself from family and friends, but it is still a requirement at least once a day. He stipulates some time for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and for his deen. Now, what I mean by mubtadi and muntahi, mubtadi literally means a beginner. So it could be like a beginner, say, for knowledge, seeking knowledge. It could be, say, a beginner in the path of suluk. It could be a beginner for something religious such as da'wah, tabligh, and so on. Now, what this particular hadith is telling us is that a mubtadi, just take an example for studying knowledge, is actually considered good and desirable that he actually secludes himself from his family. He goes to, say, a madrasa or a boarding school, Islamic institution, where he's away from family, where he's away from friends, so that he can put all his effort in acquiring knowledge and learning knowledge. He can also at the same time rectify his spiritual side, his inner self, his heart, and so on and so forth, so that when he then comes back to his people, back to his community, he'll be able to give them da'wah, he'll be able to convey the message of Allah, and that conveying of the message, because he spent his time away from family in the khidmat of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in the path of Allah, that particular message when he then conveys to people will be more stronger. Then he goes on to say that a person who's muntahi, which means a person who's already reached a peak in that particular field, who's reached high status in that particular field, even though for that individual it's not a requirement that he secludes himself from his family and his friends, but even then it is considered desirable and to say to a certain extent obligation for someone who is close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to stipulate or to spend some part of his day solely and exclusively for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this can be actually derived from another Quranic verse where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَإِذَا فَرَغْتَ فَانْصَبْ وَإِلَىٰ رَبِّكَ فَرْغَبْ. This actually was an order to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam that throughout the day when you are busy with khidmah, when you are busy with da'wah, when you are busy with conveying the message of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then at night time, وَإِلَىٰ رَبِّكَ فَرْغَبْ, which means return to your Lord at night time. And from there the scholars have derived the importance of tahajjud prayer, in particular for ulamas, in particular for those who are da'is and those who are preachers, that throughout the day when you are busy doing khidmat of deen, giving talks, giving lectures, giving them da'wah, inviting them towards the religion, these kind of things. So, that is ibadat in a way, but that is indirect ibadat. But then at night time, you then need to do your direct ibadat with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, whether it is in terms of tahajjud, whether it is in terms of dhikr or any other kind of thing. You need to be doing your direct worship and direct ibadat to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this is what this particular hadith is telling us, that look, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he was a mubtadi. Because remember, before prophethood, he was going to the cave Hira to seek the truth. So he was a mubtadi. So what he did was that every Ramadan, as I mentioned in last week's lesson, he would go to cave Hira for i'tikaf, secluding himself totally from his family, and he would try to remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, try to seek the truth and try to seek the haqq. So what we can understand is that for a muqtadi, it's always best that you try to put 100% your effort and exert all you have for that particular task. And the way it can be achieved to a certain extent is by leaving your family, by leaving your loved ones, so that you're in the path of Allah, so that when you then reach that particular state, then you could come back to your people, to your family, and then you could do what you need to do, and also at the same time remembering Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So that is the first point which we can gather from this particular hadith. The second point which we can gather from this particular hadith is the hugging of Sayyiduna Jibreel alayhi salam of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And this has been the tariqah, or you could say the way of our Kabiri, that they would pass knowledge, spiritual knowledge, in this particular way, from one's chest to another. And that's why when our Akabirins and pious predecessors, when they talk about knowledge, whether the internal knowledge or external knowledge, they always touch on the importance of this knowledge which we are teaching you about Quran, Hadith, about the Seerah, about Tafsir and so on. The beauty about that is that it's from one's heart to another. When we look at man-made knowledge, that is just from one's tongue to another or one's brain to another. But when it comes to knowledge about the Quran or Hadith, because it's like a spiritual knowledge, so therefore what we are saying, even though I'm using the tongue to convey the message or tell you about the Seerah, but in fact this particular knowledge is from my chest and it's being passed on to your chest as well. So that is like the beauty of Islamic knowledge and spiritual knowledge, is that it is being conveyed and passed from one's chest to another. And there are many ahadith where we can actually find Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam passing knowledge to companions through his chest and by hugging them. And a good example of that will be a hadith from Sahih al-Bukhari, where Sayyidina Abu Hurairah anhu narrates that once Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam hugged me, and he passed his knowledge from his chest to my chest. And thereafter, when Sayyidina Abu Hurairah anhu then goes on to say that from that moment I never ever forgot a hadith which Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said. There's also examples of Ibn Abbas anhu, that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam also hugged him and passed so much knowledge, wealth of knowledge to Ibn Abbas anhu. And Ibn Abbas anhu, a great companion, but also he was also known as a great mufassir of the Holy Quran. Many of the aqwals or various tafsirs which we read, many of those tafsirs or sayings are actually from Sayyidina Ibn Abbas anhu. So that was all done from the hugging of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam with Ibn Abbas anhu and passing all his knowledge to Sayyidina Ibn Abbas anhu. So that is the second point which we can gather from this particular hadith. The third point which we can gather from this hadith and incident is that whenever someone is worried, or if something has happened to you, or if something is going to happen to you, and you feel a bit worried, or as we say in Urdu, we feel a bit bechain about something, then it's always good and advisable that you then speak to someone about it, in particular someone close like your wife. And this again is derived from this particular hadith that when Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, after this incident, Sayyidina Jibreel alayhi salam, as I mentioned, that he was very, very worried. So when he returned home, the first person he spoke to was Sayyidah Khadija anha. So from this we can understand that when you are going through any difficulty, or if you are worried, then it's always good that you speak to people about it. And you realize that when you speak to people about it, then they just feel much better, especially people who suffer from depression actually and anxiety. They will tell you that when they actually speak to someone and they just like let everything out, and they explain, this is the situation I'm going through, this is a problem I'm going through, even though you don't have to be an expert in depression, you're just like a normal person, but you're just giving that individual as I say, an ear to listen to, and you just say a few consoling words, they feel much better afterwards. So exactly as well that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he was going through a bit of difficulty here, because as I said, this incident which happened, he was very unaware, he was like very surprised, he wasn't sure what to make of this. So there afterwards, when he went to Khadija anha and he spoke to her, Khadija anha then consoled Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam felt much better afterwards. So that is the third point which we can gather from this hadith. The fourth point which we can gather from this particular hadith is that whenever again someone, if he's in some kind of need, or again if he's in some kind of situation where he's looking for an answer, or he's looking for a solution, then again what we can gather from this hadith is that one should go to the ulama and one should go to the scholars for the answer. Again, when Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam explained everything to Khadija anha then took Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam to Waraqa bin Nawfal. And Waraqa bin Nawfal was Khadija anha's cousin brother, and he at that time he was the alim. He was the person who had knowledge of the previous book, and he was you could say the imam or the alim at that particular time. So what we can gather is that if something has happened and you're unaware or you're not sure about the solution, you're not sure about the answer, then what you should do is that you should then speak to an alim about it, consult the imam, and then he will try to, inshallah, advise you and show you the right way. So that is the third point which we can gather from this particular hadith. Another point which we can gather from this particular hadith is having respect for your elders. Even though you, i.e. the person who's younger, he may be more knowledgeable than the elders, or he may be more virtuous than the elders. Because when we look through the hadith, we can see that how much respect Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam showed Waraqa bin Nawfal. Even though Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he was more virtuous than Waraqa bin Nawfal. Obviously, he was the final prophet of Allah, the most noblest and the most virtuous. But even then, he showed a lot of respect to Waraqa bin Nawfal. So what we can understand, why? Because Waraqa was older than him. So what we can understand is our elders, those who are older than us, we should respect them, we should try to do their khidmah, try to look after them. And it's mentioned in a hadith, a very famous hadith of Sunan al-Tirmidhi, that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam has said that whoever does khidmah or whoever looks after our elderly, so it could be elderly meaning your parents, or it could be anyone who's just old and you're looking after him, then the hadith goes on to say that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will then appoint someone who will look after him when he gets old. So as we were saying, like if what comes around goes around. So exactly in this hadith of Sunan al-Tirmidhi, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said that you look after the elders. Obviously try to look after your parents, but if they're not around, then anyone who's old, could be an uncle, grandfather, it could be the person who sits in the masjid. You do his khidmat, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, what he will do is that he will also send someone or appoint someone when you are old, and that person will look after you as well. So obviously what we can gather from this hadith, the respect of elders and how Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam respected Waraqah bin Nawfal. And again, when we look through this hadith, remember the whole point of doing the seerah was so that we can, follow the way of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam and follow the sunnah. Even from this particular hadith, we can derive so many rulings, so many maslas of how to behave, how to contact people, how to treat elders and so on. This again tells us how Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam's life, how unique it was, that he told us and he preached to us and he taught us every single, thing about our deen and about our religion and how to live our life according to the sunnah and his blessed ways. Now after Sayyidina Jibreel alayhi salam conveyed the Tawheed and the oneness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the next thing which Sayyidina Jibreel alayhi salam preached to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was regarding wudu and salah. And it's mentioned in a hadith book, Dalail Abu Nu'aym, that Sayyidina Jibreel alayhi salam thereafter came to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He then dragged his heels, or Jibreel alayhi salam dragged his heels on the ground, on the earth, and a fountain of water came out. So thereafter Jibreel alayhi salam did wudu, and then Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, on seeing Jibreel alayhi salam doing wudu, he then went and did wudu. Jibreel alayhi salam then prayed salah, and then Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam prayed salah behind him. Thereafter Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam then went home and then told Khadija anha how to do wudu and how to pray salah, and then they started praying salah and namaz straight away. So what we can understand here is again the importance of salah, that one of the very first things which were made obligatory. Obviously the 5 daily prayers which were made obligatory, that came later on, and we're going to look at this later. But even from the very beginning, according to this particular hadith, it also tells us the importance of salah, that after the oneness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was preached and was conveyed, the next thing which Jibreel alayhi salam taught Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was regarding how to do wudu and how to pray salah. Now when Sayyidina Jibreel alayhi salam conveyed the message of Islam and conveyed the message of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam's prophethood and bi'athah, it's mentioned that the very first person to believe in Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was Khadija anha. Thereafterwards, it was Waraqah bin Nawfal, Khadija anha's cousin brother, and the third person to believe after Waraqah bin Nawfal was Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam's cousin brother, Sayyiduna Ali radhiyallahu anhu. Now Hazrat Ali radhiyallahu anhu was in Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam's care at that particular time. And as you probably know that Ali radhiyallahu anhu was actually the son of Abu Talib. And what happened was that in Mecca at that time there was a big plague and a big famine going on. So Abu Talib, he had a lot of children. So Hazrat Abbas anhu, who was Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam's uncle, and Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, they went to Abu Talib and they said to him that, look, you've got a lot of children, a famine is going on, how are you going to look after the children? So Hazrat Abbas anhu and Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said to Abu Talib that you give us some of your children and we will look after them for you. So it's mentioned that Hazrat Abbas anhu took Hazrat Ja'far anhu from Abu Talib, and Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam took Hazrat Ali anhu from Abu Talib into his care. And it's mentioned that once Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam and Khadija anha, they were praying salah, namaz by themselves at home, when Ali anhu saw them praying. So Ali anhu then asked Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam that, why are you praying, what are you doing? So then Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said to Hazrat Ali anhu that this is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's deen, this is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's religion. And he said that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has sent me as a prophet to this world, to this dunya, to convey the message of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and to convey the oneness of Allah. Now Hazrat Ali radiallahu anhu then said to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam that, let me ask my father Abu Talib, and whatever he says, then I will tell you tomorrow. Now Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam at that time, he didn't want everyone to know about this particular religion. So he said to Hazrat Ali radiallahu anhu that, look, if you don't want to believe, then don't believe. Don't go and tell your father, don't go and tell my uncle Abu Talib, because he's going to be a bit upset and he may cause a bit of issue here. So he said to him that you just believe, but if you don't want to believe, then don't tell anyone. Now the next day, Hazrat Ali radiallahu anhu came to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and overnight Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala put some hidayat and put some nur in his heart. So the next day when Hazrat Ali radiallahu anhu came, he came and he said to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam that I want to believe in Islam. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam then told him to say the kalima, to say the shahadatain, and Hazrat Ali radiallahu anhu converted towards Islam. So he was the third person to convert to Islam, and thereafter was the next person to convert towards Islam was Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam's freed slave, who later became his adopted son, whose name was Sayyiduna Zayd bin Harith radiallahu anhu. He was the fourth person to convert towards Islam. Now after Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam converted his close family members to Islam, the next person who he gave da'wah to was his close friend Hazrat Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu. Now when Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam conveyed the message of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to Hazrat Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, Hazrat Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu straight away he accepted the da'wah and he accepted Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam's message, and he became a Muslim straight away. And this is one of the fazilat of Hazrat Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, and that's why it's mentioned in a hadith that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said that everyone who became a Muslim during that time, they had this, as we say in Urdu, al-lachak. Lachak meaning that they had this kind of slight doubt about Islam. What kind of religion is it? Is it the true religion? What Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam claiming about the oneness of Allah, seeing the angels, is it true, and so on. They had a bit of doubt, but eventually they kind of got over the doubt and they became believers. But when it came to Hazrat Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, as soon as Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said it, Hazrat Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu automatically straight away became Muslim. He didn't even have a single doubt. And that's why he's called as-Siddiq, Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiallahu anhu. Why? Because he straight away did tasdeeq, meaning he straight away believed and accepted what Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said without having any doubt, without even thinking about it. Even Abu Ali radiallahu anhu, as we looked at the story, he said, now can you give me some time to think about it? And it was overnight when he thought about it. Ali radiallahu anhu the following day came and believed in Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But for Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, as soon as Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said it, straight away he became a believer. Now, for 3 years approximately, Islam was very, very discreet. In terms of only Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam's close family members, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam's close friends, they knew about it and they accepted Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam's message and they converted towards Islam. Now 3 years after the first incident of the cave of Hira, the following verse was revealed by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, where it says, فَاصْدَعْ بِمَا تُعْمَرُ وَأَعْرِضْ عَنِ الْمُشْرِكِينَ, which means, فَاصْدَعْ here means that convey explicitly بِمَا تُعْمَرُ, what you have been ordered to do, وَأَعْرِضْ عَنِ الْمُشْرِكِينَ, and turn your face away from the mushrikeen. Similarly, there's another verse which was revealed where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَأَنزِلْ عَشِيرَتَكَ الْأَقْرَبِينَ, which means that warn your close family members and your close relatives. So these two verses and other verses similar, they were the verses which led to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam now giving open da'wah about Islam and about the message of the oneness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and about his prophethood. And it's mentioned that when that verse وَأَنذِرْ عَشِيرَتَكَ الْأَقْرَبِينَ was revealed, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he invited all the Arab tribes. He climbed up Mount Safa and he invited all the tribes of Quraysh, all the Arabian tribes to get together. And then Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam in a loud voice then said to them that if I was to tell you that behind this mountain an army is going to come and invade you, would you believe in me? So all of them replied by saying, yes, we will believe in you. And why did they say yes is because, as I mentioned before, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam had the laqab, the title of as-sadiq, being the truthful. So when they said that, everyone believed. They said that yes, we will believe in you. Thereafter, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam then said that I am a nazir, I am a warner, and I have come or I have been sent by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as a Rasul and as a messenger to tell you about the eternal punishment if you do not believe in Allah and if you do not believe in me. Now when the Arab tribes, when they heard this, they were like shocked, they were astonished that, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam claiming to be a prophet, claiming that there is only one God, because they were brought up believing that there are many, many gods. They believe that there's a God for this, there's a God for rain, there's a God for wind, there's a God for this and that. Many, many gods they believed in. So when Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was telling them that no, there is only one God, they were shocked and they were like thinking, what's happening here? And this led to Abu Lahab, again, who was the uncle of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, saying the word tabban lak, which means destruction to you. Alihaza jama'tana, is it because of this reason you have gathered us? Meaning that you have gathered all of us here under this particular mountain. Is it because so that you can tell us and convey the message to us that there is only one God? And thereafter was the Surah Tabbat Yada Abi Lahabi Watab was revealed regarding Abu Lahab and his wife, whose name was Jamil. They were like staunch enemies of Islam. They, when we talk about hated Islam, that's like an understatement. They had so much hatred and jealousy for Islam. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed a verse about them and their hatred and their jealousy of Islam when they were seeing that Islam was slowly increasing. And thereafter Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us how Abu Lahab and his wife Jamil were destroyed. And the way Abu Lahab was destroyed is that because he would mock Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and his deen and his Rasul. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created this kind of disease, or this kind of, like you could say, illness on Abu Lahab, which caused like his body parts to fall off, and there was this kind of like a really foul smell and a stench coming from his body. Now when he died, when Abu Lahab died, then none of his sons were willing to actually do his janazah. Janazah meaning like to give him a burial. They were fearing that, look, if we were to touch our father, then it could be so that we could catch this particular disease and illness. So what they did was that they dug a hole, they got a stick and they kind of poked their father into that particular hole and they dumped him there. So this was his hashar. Hashar meaning that this is how he died. So what we can understand is that those people who mock Allah, the Rasul, who mock the deen, then their hashar will be very, very severe. And the same also happened to his wife Jamil, who again would kind of make false lies about Islam, about Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So once she was returning from the jungle, carrying some firewood on her head, and she had this kind of small rope around her neck, which she would then place the sticks on top of their head, and then she would tie the rope around it. So what happened was that once she was walking, she then slipped, which then caused the rope to then press against her throat, and she strangled to death in that particular way. So what we can understand is that those people who disobey Allah's commands, who disobey Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, mock his religion, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will punish them very severely. So this was like the story of how Abu Lahab and his wife Jamil were destroyed. So as I was saying, the last particular point here, that initially the da'wah was given discreetly, but then later on when Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam saw that there was like a base here of very, very good, hard-working and honest people like Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, dedicated people like Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, Ali radiallahu anhu, And Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam thought, and also a message from Allah that look, this is now the time to then actually broaden the da'wah, broaden the message of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and this is what led to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam giving that open invitation to the Arab tribes. Allah gives the tawfiq to everyone who said wa akhir da'wana.
Any questions?